excited to see you all here. Fellow people that care about saving the world. It's something I think about all day long. I get to hang out with volunteers all the time, making a big difference, and you're some of them right now. And so is our speaker today, Mr. Timothy DenHerder-Thomas. So here's Timothy's bio. Timothy is the co-founder and general manager of Cooperative Energy Futures, or CEF, Cooperative Energy Futures, an energy efficiency and community-owned clean energy cooperative serving members across Minnesota since 2009.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I'm Timothy. I'm going to share my screen, go through a couple of slides here. I asked a little bit about kind of the desired content of this group and got a sense that everyone here is obviously very familiar with what's going on with climate, but a wide range of interests and levels of experience around solar. So I will do my best to make this both broad and deep in terms of talking about what's happening with clean energy here in Minnesota. I wanted to start by framing the problem in terms of what's happening with clean energy development, particularly solar. First and foremost, energy utilities, which historically have been charged by our state and federal government with providing energy, have not been making the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy fast enough. They've also been primarily using approaches to making that transition that raise ratepayer costs, basically that involve more utility investment and therefore utility profit. And also, as many of us know, most households, we think the number is somewhere over 80%, can't install solar themselves due to a wide array of issues, including shading, structural issues with their home, if you're a renter, costs, all that relates to financing. There's all sorts of barriers preventing individual people from doing this themselves. So we're kind of in a situation here where, as we know, we need to switch to renewable energy extremely quickly. The utilities are kind of dragging their feet and doing it in ways that are expensive and inequitable, and most people can't do it themselves. So the question is, what do we do? How do we break the logjam? Some solutions. Many households can participate in community solar gardens as a way to cut their energy costs. There's also some new models for rooftop solar that can make solar accessible to a wide range of people and make it more like paying a utility bill so that it doesn't require that upfront investment. I want to highlight that everything we're going to talk about today is kind of things that are promising in terms of things that could make clean energy accessible to all. But I will also highlight throughout that it's not going to happen on its own. It takes a lot of focus on very careful attention to the structural barriers, and I think a real commitment to equity, justice, and access for everyone to make that vision a reality. The thing I really want to emphasize about all of that is if we don't make the transition to clean energy work for everyone, it's not going to happen for everyone. And if it doesn't happen for everyone, we're not going to solve the climate crisis. I wanted to give you a little bit of a landscape about what's happening in Minnesota. I have continually looked for updates since 2018, but this is still the best graph I've been able to find. So it's a little bit out of date, but the trend is still generally the same. There's 3 categories of solar here. And again, this is installations per year. So new projects added by megawatts. A lot of the time when we think about solar, we think about rooftop solar on a home or in a business. And for a very long time, that was really how solar was done in Minnesota since the foundation of the industry back in the 60s. That's pretty much what people were doing. They're putting solar on individual roofs themselves. As you look at this graph, all of the solar that is being installed on homes, all of the solar that is being installed by businesses on their roofs, really all of the distributed solar that's happening in the state is this dark gray section way at the bottom. You can see that that's basically all there was up until about 2015 or 2016. But now it has really become dwarfed by other types of solar that are being installed. You also now have occasional utility solar projects, although I will again mention that most of the utility scale solar to date has been installed based on state mandates. So the state government has said you need to install the solar project or the PUC has ruled that solar is the most cost-effective option for a certain project. And so periodically in certain years, utilities have built a lot of solar. But as you can see in 2018, when there wasn't a specific need, there wasn't a lot of project built. So it really is driven by state law and state regulation. The third category of community solar has actually grown to now make up slightly over half of all the solar installed in the state. And this is really because of state law that was passed in 2013, and the rules got finalized at the end of 2014, that allows third parties, people who develop solar on the grid, to connect renewable energy to Minnesota's electric grid, and then find customers, individual households or businesses, to subscribe on a voluntary basis and get the benefits of that energy as a credit on the bill. And because it is allowing solar to be developed at intermediate and larger scales, it's not dependent on each individual household figuring out the financing. And it's also not dependent on a regulator or the state legislature telling somebody you must do this. It's really a sector that has grown very quickly in the state. The thing I want to emphasize, though, is that doesn't necessarily make it inclusive or equitable. Right now, about 85% of the entire quote unquote community solar industry in Minnesota is subscribing commercial customers. Only about 15% is serving residents. And then within that residential category, many developers are using credit or income qualifications, so that a lot of the people in Minnesota who face the highest energy burdens, often renters, often low income, often people of color, are being shut out of the opportunity by most of the developers. So there are some major structural issues in terms of how this is rolled out in practice. I want to just briefly highlight, I'm coming at this from a cooperative perspective, from a member-owned business that is trying to address these access principles, and just wanted to highlight what we mean when we say that community solar should be rooted in community. First and foremost, we're talking about access. So everyone can participate, regardless of rentership status, and particularly low-income folks and communities of color. Supporting community-led creation, so local governments and organizations being at the forefront of launching and envisioning projects. Community ownership, so making sure that there's decision-making control and also economic benefits from solar coming back to community. One of the things that has actually strongly undermined political support for the community solar program here in Minnesota has been that the vast majority of the ownership is absentee, ultimately Wall Street or other private companies. And that has really eroded the political support, particularly on the Republican side of the spectrum for this program, which I think is really to the detriment of the industry as a whole. And then finally, the job creation, business development, all of those economic opportunities should really be rooted in community. And one of the things that I'll highlight is that as you look around the country, solar and wind projects where it's large absentee companies coming in have generated a lot of opposition, like local community opposition for siting large projects in communities. And you haven't seen that when there are projects that are community owned, community vision, community rooted. And I think it's really important for us to think about as we make this transition with climate change solutions. How do we do it in a way that gets everyone in our community to see this as a solution for them and that's benefiting us all? Many of you are probably very familiar with community solar, but I just wanted to do a really quick comparison with what many of us are more familiar with on site, just so that kind of the distinctions are clear. So again, it is open to a broad range of people. I'll explain the asterisk in a moment. You don't have to have a home that is good for solar. So you can be in a shaded building or an apartment building where you don't have access to your roof or whatever. You don't have to make physical changes. So for a lot of people, figuring out wiring and meters and making sure that you're maintaining it is a big concern. There's a lot of different ways to pay for it, which is starting to happen also with on-site solar in Minnesota, but is rarer. So it can eliminate that upfront cost barrier. Customers don't have debt obligations. The key distinction from a tax perspective is that with community solar, you don't actually own the system. So the federal tax credits don't go to the people who are subscribing. They go to whoever's developing the project, and it ends up being a pretty complicated financing process to make sure you can use that. In comparison to on-site solar, where you obviously have to own your building, a roof, and pay your bill, have to have good sun. It's on your roof and it's wired to your meter, so there are physical changes happening to your home. Usually, this is a thing you have to pay up front for. Most households have to pay $10,000 to $20,000, sometimes even more, either having cash or having loans, usually with personal debt. But individual homeowners do receive the solar tax credits. Now, I want to talk about that asterisk about saying, anyone with an electric bill. Well, the way this was set up with community solar in Minnesota was that Xcel Energy is the only utility that has to run a program, and other utilities can. So here's a map of who operates community solar. The red is investor-owned utilities, and Xcel is most of the red in this general area, the southern part of Minnesota. A lot of the red up here is Minnesota Power. Xcel Energy is the only utility that has an open access program. So somewhere between 90 and 95% of all of the community solar in Minnesota is in Xcel territory, because anyone can develop. So geographically, all those little red areas down here don't look like very much of the state, but population-wise, it's about 55% of the state's population, because it's the majority of the Twin Cities area and a few other major metro areas like St. Cloud and Mankato, and a few others. All of these other programs in rural electric co-ops, these little green municipal utilities, Minnesota Power, they're all voluntary, and the utility gets to decide how much solar happens and what are the terms. So many of them have high upfront cost, or are only 40 kilowatts, which means, maybe 10 people or so can participate in them. So options in greater Minnesota are really limited, and it requires cajoling and convincing the utility to offer an opportunity like this that makes sense. And let's keep in mind that even for rooftop solar in large parts of the state, many of these local utilities have very punitive financial arrangements where if you try and install solar yourself, they'll actually charge you extra for your right to connect to the grid, which can make it very hard to make these projects pencil. So there's a lot of utility barriers to making solar work, especially outside of the Xcel territory, where there's very strong rules and regulations. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the types of community building that can happen with community solar. This is a launch event for the project that we did on the roof of Shiloh Temple in North Minneapolis, bringing together leaders from the church, leaders from a nearby mosque, local residents who are subscribers, local residents who helped install the array, local elected officials who helped envision the community solar program. It's really a way to bring people together to kind of see the transition to renewable energy in a new light as something that they can participate in, and as something that builds community. The workforce piece has also been a really important piece of our work, and I think it's a growing piece in the Minnesota solar industry as a whole. As a co-op, we have used a 50% minority hiring requirement, and we're actually now starting to work with some of the folks, particularly from North Minneapolis, who have been trained through now several years of installing solar arrays and are looking to start their own businesses, because we've seen that as a really important way to build more economic power in communities of color through the transition to renewable energy. And I'll just mention one of these guys who got trained and started to do solar installs on some of our first community solar gardens, has been working in the solar industry now 6 or 7 years, is also a subscriber to the project that he helped build, and also recently ran and was elected to our board of directors, kind of closing that loop in terms of governance, participation, and direct work and labor. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what some of these larger community solar projects look like, this is a project we did in the city of Edina on a roof of the city public works building. And we see a huge opportunity in partnering with local governments as well as commercial buildings and schools to host solar, again, that benefits the whole community. There's around 75 community members who offset their entire power usage from this project, but that it's hosted in a central location in the community. Similarly, there's a lot of projects in greater Minnesota. This is a site that we have developed and operate just outside of Faribault that has residents in the Northfield area, in Faribault itself, in rural Dakota and Goodhue County, residents and manufactured housing parks in Cannon Falls and Northfield. There's just a lot of ways to, I think, build unusual connections and relationships between people who might not otherwise, have a sense of shared identity by being part of these shared clean energy projects that reduce utility costs, yes, but also invite people to participate in a cooperative, share profits, all of that sort of thing. And this is a really exciting and huge amount of brain damage project that we took on. This is a solar canopy over the top level of ramp A in downtown Minneapolis. So that's a target field right in the background. This is, right in downtown. I won't go into it just for the sake of time, but we had to solve so many regulatory and permitting, engineering and design, financial, technical issues to pull this off. And I think it highlights both the value of figuring out how we can put solar in the urban environment, but also that there's many layers of complexity in terms of making that sort of thing happen. But it's particularly important because increasingly in rural areas, there just isn't the grid infrastructure to accommodate huge amounts of renewable energy. Right now, most of our grid infrastructure for distributing renewable energy is located where all the load is, where all the people are. And so I think it means we have to start getting creative about this urban-rural relationship and how much of our energy is going to come in from outside of our major metro areas, and how much of it is going to be produced, where most people live. It's obviously a lot easier to build these projects in greater Minnesota, but the grid doesn't always have space. Just an example of what it was like to bring people together around these projects prior to our current pandemic. We have been missing what it's like to have big giant celebrations, but we're looking forward to that again someday. And I wanted to close just by giving you a little bit of a look under the hood of what it takes to develop solar projects, starting with the players. Really at the center of developing a larger solar project, and sometimes even with portfolios of residential projects or small commercial projects for groups of businesses or schools, you'll have an entity that plays this developer role, really coordinating the pieces. There's all of the kind of siting issues. So working with the utility to get permission to connect to the grid, working with counties and cities to get local permitting authority, working with host sites to get agreement to use their physical space, whether that's land or rooftop. Then there's the whole financing structure. So usually setting up a special purpose entity or LLC, and bringing in the lenders, the tax equity investors, usually a core entity that is looking to long-term own called a sponsor. And then in community solar, you have the whole subscriber engagement piece, managing subscribers, operating the projects over time. You then, of course, have the whole process of building it in the first place. So you have what's usually called an EPC contractor, which is basically the installer. They're getting their construction permits. They have suppliers for all the physical equipment and materials, solar panels, racking, inverters, so on and so forth. And then workers, training programs that support workers, subcontractors that manage different pieces of it. Just for clarity, I wanted to give a sense of the pieces of this that our organization, Cooperative Energy Features, directly manages. We hire out, the installers and the actual operations and maintenance and installation, and then we work with utilities, permitting agencies, host sites, lenders, tax equity investors to pull everything together. Key piece here is that, again, as a co-op, we bring in community members as our member owners to run the business. Finally, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of all the steps for projects. So securing sites could be rooftops in a municipality, could be open land. Securing interconnection agreements with utilities. In many cases, there's also an application process for getting program approval. Managing installation contractors, securing zoning permitting and other land use rules. Securing and structuring project financing. Again, if this is an individual or small business system, this might be a relatively simple thing that the individual household is doing. On these larger projects, it's usually a pretty complex financial structure that the developer company pulling it together has to coordinate and structure. For community solar, there's engaging community subscribers, and then the ongoing technical management, making sure that there's no issues with the equipment and production, insurance, warranties, all of that, and ongoing subscriber and member management if it's a community solar project. It's been really a wild ride getting experience in all of these different scopes, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but I'm happy to talk about any of the individual pieces of this. And it really has been quite an adventure to be involved in creating all of the structures for developing these types of projects at scale, as Minnesota is, I think, really for the first time developing its system for community scale energy development, and has seen that actually become a faster and more rapidly scalable way to develop clean energy, even than what a lot of the utilities are doing. So we see a lot of opportunity there. We're also seeing, I think, a transition from rooftop and on-site solar being kind of a boutique market for a small number of people to becoming more mainstream, as has happened in some other parts of the country. So we really look forward to that taking off in the years ahead, and we're involved in making that more accessible for renters as well. So with that, there's my contact information if you want to record that, and I will now open it up for questions. And I already see a hand.
Yeah, just real quickly, we probably have a little over 5 minutes. So if you could use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen, click on reactions and there's a little raise hand icon, hit that. So Lincoln?
So I got a message from Crow Wing Power, which is the utility provider at our cabin. And it is about a community solar array that they're wanting to install. So they are looking for subscribers. So it's a 500 kilowatt system for 111 people, cost approximately $1,300. And they say that each share should produce an annual average approximately $4.50 credit per month on your bill for 20 years. That comes out to about $1,000, and I don't understand the financial side of that.
Yeah, I can't really explain why they chose to do it that way. But as I mentioned briefly, a lot of the rural electric co-ops have developed projects in a way that's not terribly cost effective for their members. I don't know to what degree that is they're building a system that's more expensive than it needs to be, or they're not actually providing very much compensation to residents per kilowatt hour. But there are a lot of systems like that where they're kind of designing it as a price premium whether because they just designed the project in a way where it costs more, or they want it to cost more so that it's a thing that people will only do if they want to pay that perk.
Thanks. Dana, go ahead.
Thanks, Charlie. Great presentation, Timothy. Thank you for coming to our group here today. I work for an organization that's one of the commercial entities that's committed to community solar. And the two big constraints that we saw going into this and continuing forward is the period of commitment, which was 25 years, and also availability. I believe both of those things are still in effect, that you have to commit to or subscribe to solar gardens that are in your county or in an adjacent county. I think that's been bandied about at the legislature, but I don't think it's changed. So I was wondering if you could speak to those two things, please.
Yeah, the 25-year commitment is not a legal requirement for subscribers. It's more of a term that financiers usually like to see. So there are some ways that you can design your contracts in ways that financiers will accept to give flexibility around that. For example, we technically have 25-year commitments, but all of our subscribers can exit with 3 months notice with no penalty. So there are ways to create flexibility like that. The contiguous county requirement is still in place for Excel, which means that you can only subscribe to a project if you're in the same county or an adjacent county. That is a limitation. I think there's also some logic to it, meaning like, you know, it's creating some barriers, but I think there is some value in having a project that is somewhat geographically close to the people who are there. And I also wanted to highlight that what we're starting to see is that while it's a lot easier to get land in greater Minnesota, and so a lot of developers would like to get sites in greater Minnesota and sell to customers in the Twin Cities, there's not as much grid infrastructure in greater Minnesota. And so you're starting to run into more and more constraints to put power onto the grid in large parts of the state, just because there's so much already out there.
Eric?
Oh man, I got a lot of questions. I just want to get your take on a few different things. So, how do you think about the supply chain of solar panels? You know, where they're made, where the polysilicon comes from. Does that, you know, tug on your heartstrings a little bit to know what's happening to produce these panels that are so cheap?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, you know, something like 90 to 95% of the actual silicon wafer supply is coming from China, and particularly Western China, and all the human rights issues that are happening there is a big issue. It's an issue with just about anything related to minerals and electronics these days. We need to figure out a solution to it. Like, I think the one thing that like is helpful is that there's not a lot materially or technologically that prevents you from doing it better in a sustainable way, because it is, the vast majority is like silicon, aluminum, basically highly abundant minerals and elements. We just need to find fairer and better ways to manufacture them and process them. I could talk about that for a long time. Supply chain issues are a really big problem right now. And there is interest in more and more domestic manufacturing, but even domestic manufacturing is getting a lot of their supplies from overseas.
So you are fully aware of like the forced labor?
Fully aware.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. I worry that the various biases so many of us have, you know, maybe block that news story out to a solar developer. But I'm glad we, you know, have a sense of the quandary we find ourselves in as we push to decarbonize as rapidly as possible. Of the money that people put into community gardens. Is any of that also sectioned away for grid infrastructure, for building out the grid infrastructure? Are we hoping to get the government to pay for all of that, or who's going to pay to accommodate and store the energy? And where do you think that's going to come from?
So the way that it currently works is each project, meaning the developer and therefore ultimately its cash flow of subscribers, has to pay for all of the grid upgrades it needs to put its projects online. But that's kind of a case-by-case approach to a solution. And what often happens is often there will be a limit at which point to put more solar energy onto the grid or any kind of energy onto the grid, you need a much larger infrastructure upgrade than any one project can itself justify. And the system right now is not set up to kind of socialize or have a large number of projects share those costs. And currently the utilities, when they want to build projects and they need to build infrastructure for that, they are able to just charge that to all of us as ratepayers. So there's kind of a fundamental inequity in terms of how costs are being structured and shared in terms of how energy is developed. And, you know, there's a lot of complex questions here around the share of the costs that should be on participants versus society as a whole. And over time, how does that benefit society as a whole? And I think it's a really important question. I think it's important to start off with the understanding that the way that these things get paid for in third-party solar energy versus large power plants that the utilities developed is not a level playing field right now.
I can't disagree with any of that, but it also it just scares me, the grid fragilization. You got to have a way to back it up, right? I mean,
sorry, what's the concern?
I haven't heard. What's your ideal backup? Is it natural gas for a while, and hopefully we can make hydrogen out of solar? Is it wind? What are you thinking for the rest of the energy pie?
I think it's a combination of wind, diversified location, storage, and load management, meaning changing when we use energy to match supply. There's more and more technology enabling us to do that.